Hello, friend. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you somewhere warm with windows open to the evening air? Or perhaps bundled against winter's chill, watching frost patterns form on glass? Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're traveling to a place that exists now mostly in dust and memory, yet it gave birth to ideas so powerful they shaped every civilization that followed. We're going to the land between two rivers, Mesopotamia, to explore not just a mythology, but the very first mythology humanity ever wrote down. Picture this. Sometime around 3200 BCE, in the Fertile Crescent of modern-day Iraq, someone pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and made marks that weren't just pictures or tallies. They were words, stories, and among the very first things humans chose to preserve forever in writing were tales of their gods. Why does this matter? Because before Mesopotamia, human religious thought evaporated like morning mist. We can guess at what our ancestors believed by looking at burial sites, cave paintings, carved figurines. But we can't hear their voices. The Mesopotamians changed that. When you read about Zeus or Odin, about biblical creation or any divine pantheon that followed, you're reading echoes of Mesopotamian thought. They invented the template. But here's what makes this mythology especially fascinating. It wasn't static. We're not looking at one mythology, but rather a conversation spanning 3,000 years, across multiple civilizations, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, each adding their voice, each reinterpreting what came before. Imagine if every religious text from the Roman Empire through the Renaissance existed simultaneously, influencing each other, contradicting each other, evolving together. That's Mesopotamian mythology. The geography itself shaped these beliefs in profound ways. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the land was brutally unpredictable. Unlike Egypt, where the Nile flooded with reassuring regularity, these rivers were chaotic. They might rise gently or catastrophically. They might not rise enough, bringing drought and famine. The gods of Mesopotamia reflected this reality. They were powerful, often capricious, and humanity's relationship with them was one of service and apprehension, not comfort. In these city-states, Uruk, Ur, Babylon, Nineveh, temples rose like artificial mountains called ziggurats, their mud-brick stairs climbing toward heaven. Each city had its patron deity, and as cities rose and fell in power, so too did their gods' influence in the pantheon. Politics and theology were inseparable. When Babylon conquered Sumer, the god Marduk's mythology expanded to incorporate and supersede older creation stories. The people who lived here were humanity's first urban civilization. They invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, the wheel, sailing ships, beer brewing, and the 60-minute hour we still use today. They created the world's first law codes, first libraries, first schools. And woven through all these innovations was a rich, complex understanding of the divine. Gods who created humanity from clay and blood, who survived a great flood, who descended to the underworld, who fought chaos dragons and established cosmic order. What questions will this story answer? We'll explore how the universe came to be from primordial waters. We'll meet gods and goddesses whose relationships mirror human drama. Love affairs, betrayals, murders, resurrections. We'll discover why humans were created, spoiler, as servants to ease the gods' workload, and what the afterlife held in store, a dusty, joyless shadow realm regardless of how you lived. We'll watch as mythology evolves to justify political power, to explain natural disasters, to give meaning to suffering. And we'll encounter stories that will feel strangely familiar because they were borrowed and transformed by cultures that followed. The flood narrative that appears in Genesis, first written in Mesopotamia 1,000 years earlier. The Garden of Immortality with its forbidden plant, Mesopotamian. The descent of a deity to the underworld and their resurrection, Mesopotamian. Even the concept of 7 days in creation appears first in Babylonian tablets. Tonight, as you drift between waking and sleep, you'll hear the oldest stories our species chose to preserve. Stories about cosmic battles and sacred marriages, about friendship and mortality, about the proper relationship between the divine and human realms. These aren't primitive myths we've outgrown. They're sophisticated attempts to answer questions we still ask. Why do we suffer? What happens when we die? How do we live meaningfully in an unpredictable world? The clay tablets these stories were written on survived because clay, when baked by conquering fires, becomes permanent. Libraries buried under collapsed palaces became accidental time capsules. British archaeologists in the 1800s shipped these tablets to museums, where scholars painstakingly learned to read cuneiform script again after it had been forgotten for 2 millennia. Each translation revealed more, sometimes confirming biblical accounts, sometimes contradicting them, always enriching our understanding of where Western civilization's foundational ideas originated. Now let's begin. We'll start where the Mesopotamians themselves started, in the beginning, when there was neither heaven nor earth, but only the mingling of fresh and salt waters in the cosmic void. In the beginning there were 2 waters. This is how the oldest creation story begins, not with light, not with a word spoken into void, but with Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu was the fresh water beneath the earth, the underground aquifers and springs. Tiamat was the salt water, the sea, chaos herself. They weren't separate entities but mingled together, their waters mixing in the primordial dark. From this mingling came the first gods, not created deliberately, but emerging naturally, inevitably, like sediment settling or crystals forming. Lamu and Lahamu appeared first, followed by Anshar and Kishar, representing the horizons, the circular boundaries of heaven and earth that didn't yet exist but would soon. These early gods were restless. They moved, they made noise, they disturbed the ancient peace. Apsu, the fresh water, grew irritated. He wanted silence, stillness, the undisturbed rest of primordial waters. He complained to Tiamat, his partner, "Their ways have become burdensome to me. By day I have no rest, at night I cannot sleep." Think about that for a moment. The very first conflict in Mesopotamian mythology isn't between good and evil, isn't about disobedience or pride, it's about noise. It's about the older generation wanting peace and quiet while the younger gods live their lives. It's almost comically relatable except for what happens next. Apsu decided to destroy them, not imprison them, not warn them, not set boundaries, destroy them utterly. When Tiamat heard this plan, she was horrified. These were her children, after all. How could we destroy what we ourselves brought forth? She asked. But Apsu had made up his mind. The young gods learned of this plot through Ea, wisest of their number, god of fresh water and magic, patron of craft and cunning. Ea was clever in ways the primal gods couldn't comprehend. He wove a spell, a magic incantation, and cast it over Apsu. He put the ancient water to sleep, deep permanent sleep, and then he killed him. Ea built his dwelling place directly over Apsu's sleeping body. The fresh waters that had once been a conscious, hostile deity now served as the foundation for Ea's temple. This is a pattern we'll see repeatedly. The old gods become the landscape, the raw material, the foundation for new divine order. In this dwelling, on this foundation of defeated primordial water, Ea's son was born. His name was Marduk, and he would become the greatest of all Mesopotamian gods, though he didn't start that way. He started as a baby, but what a baby, strong beyond measure, formed with double divine essence, with 4 eyes to see everything, for ears to hear everything. Meanwhile, Tiamat grieved. The other gods, upset that their peace was disturbed by Apsu's death, came to her and reminded her, "When Apsu was killed, you did nothing. You sat quietly while your consort was murdered." They pressured her, shamed her, pushed her toward revenge. Tiamat's grief transformed into rage. She created an army of monsters, 11 types in total. Meshusu dragons with venomous breath, Lahamu demons, scorpion men, storm demons and fishmen and mad dogs. She gave them irresistible weapons and appointed Kingu, one of the early gods, as their commander. She placed the Tablet of Destinies around Kingu's neck, the cosmic document that determined fate itself. When the younger gods learned of this army, they panicked. They held a council. Who could face Tiamat and her monsters? Who could stand against primordial chaos herself? None of them could. Not Ea, despite his wisdom. Not Anu, the sky god. They were paralyzed with fear. Then Marduk stepped forward. Still young but already formidable, he made an offer. He would fight Tiamat and her army, but only if the gods agreed to make him their king, their supreme ruler. If he succeeded, his word would become law. The tablet of destinies would be his. All the gods would bow to him. They had no choice. They agreed and prepared him for battle with weapons beyond measure. A bow, a quiver, lightning, the 4 winds, 7 winds more, including the terrible wind of 7 storms. He created a net to capture Tiamat, held by 4 cosmic winds at its corners. The battle itself was almost anticlimactic. Tiamat tried to swallow Marduk whole, but he drove the winds down her throat until she swelled like a balloon, then shot an arrow into her distended belly, splitting her heart. Her army scattered. Marduk captured them, broke their weapons, took the tablet of destinies from Kingu. Then came the act of creation. Marduk split Tiamat's corpse like a shellfish into 2 halves. From one half he made the sky, from the other the earth. Her eyes became the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Her tail became the Milky Way. Her ribs became the mountains. Her spittle became clouds. Creation in Mesopotamia wasn't a peaceful act of divine will. It was violent. It required the death of the old to make space for the new. The universe itself was fashioned from a slain goddess's body. Every time the Mesopotamians looked at rivers, mountains, stars, they saw the remains of defeated chaos. Marduk organized the cosmos next. He assigned stations to the gods, some in heaven, some on earth. He created the calendar, marking days and years. He established the positions of the stars, the movements of planets, the lunar month. The gods celebrated. They built Babylon for Marduk with its great temple Asagila, its Ziggurat et Amananki that would later inspire the Tower of Babel story. They proclaimed him by 50 names, each describing an aspect of his power and authority. But something was still missing. The gods still had to labor, building temples, maintaining order, doing the work of keeping creation running. And they were exhausted. The gods were tired. That's what it came down to ultimately. These divine beings who had just witnessed the creation of the universe, who had helped establish cosmic order, who had built the great city of Babylon, they were complaining about having to do all the work. For 40 years, the Ijiji gods, the lesser deities, the laborers of heaven, had been digging irrigation canals. They'd been dredging rivers, maintaining the cosmic waterways that Marduk's creation required. Their hands blistered, their backs ached. Divine or not, they had limits. One night they'd had enough. They burned their tools. They marched on Enlil's temple, Enlil being the senior god, second only to Marduk himself, lord of wind and authority. It was a divine labor strike, a rebellion not of violence but of exhaustion. Enlil was furious. He called for Marduk, the king of gods. "There at my door," he said. "The gods have laid down their tools. What do we do?" Marduk, still clever, still pragmatic, had an answer. He called for Ea, his father, god of wisdom and craft. "Create a substitute," Marduk said. "Let them bear the gods' burden. Let them be the ones to dig canals and maintain temples." And so, in a temple called the House of Fate, humanity was created. The process was specific, almost ritualistic. They brought Kingu forward, remember him? The god who had commanded Tiamat's monster army, who had worn the tablet of destinies. He was executed for his role in the rebellion. His blood was mixed with clay. From this mixture, Ea fashioned humanity. Think about what this means. Humans weren't created from pure divine essence. We were made from clay. The earth itself, common and humble, mixed with the blood of a rebel god. We carry both elements. We're bound to the earth, yes, but we have divine blood in our veins, even if it's the blood of a defeated rebel. Our purpose was explicit, to serve the gods, to do the labor they no longer wanted to do, to maintain temples, perform rituals, provide offerings. The gods would rest, and humanity would work. This wasn't presented as cruel in Mesopotamian thought. It was order. It was the proper arrangement of the cosmos. Everyone had their place, their role. The gods protected and provided, and humans served and sustained. It was a contract, a mutual relationship, even if the terms weren't exactly equal. The gods celebrated the creation of humanity by building more temples, more ziggurats. Each major city became the earthly home of a particular deity. Enlil in Nippur, Inanna in Uruk, Shamash the sun god in Sippar, in Eridu. These weren't just religious centers. They were the actual houses where gods dwelt, made manifest through statues that were ritually fed, clothed, bathed each day by priests. The relationship between god and city was intensely personal. When Uruk prospered, Inanna was honored. When drought struck Nippur, it was understood as Enlil's displeasure. The health of the city and the favor of its god were inseparable. This led to a theological challenge. What happened when cities went to war with each other? Were the gods fighting through their human proxies? The mythology developed sophisticated answers. Sometimes, yes, the gods battled in heaven while humans battled on earth. Other times, a god might abandon their city if the people had failed in their duties, allowing another city's god to conquer unopposed. The priesthood became humanity's crucial mediator. These weren't holy men in the sense we might imagine, spiritual counselors or moral teachers. They were professionals who knew the proper rituals, the correct offerings, the precise incantations needed to maintain cosmic order. They read omens in the liver of sacrificed sheep, in the patterns of oil on water, in the flight of birds. They interpreted dreams. They determined which days were favorable for planting, for battle, for marriage. Kings ruled with divine mandate, but they ruled as servants of the gods, not as gods themselves, with rare exceptions. A king's primary duty was to maintain the temples, to ensure the rituals continued uninterrupted, to provide for the priesthood. Military conquest and legal codes were important, yes, but secondary to religious obligation. The Mesopotamians developed what might be the world's first contract theology. They had agreements with their gods, written in stone and clay. If we perform these rituals, if we provide these offerings, then you will grant us prosperity, protection, victory. When things went wrong, when harvests failed or enemies prevailed, it meant the contract had been violated somehow. An offering missed, a ritual performed incorrectly, a moral failing somewhere in the community. This created a society perpetually examining itself for divine displeasure. Every misfortune was a message. Every disaster was a symptom of broken relationship with the divine. The gods weren't malicious, necessarily, but they demanded precision, respect, proper service. Women held significant religious roles, particularly in the temples. The end priestess in Ur was often the king's daughter, married symbolically to the moon god Nanna. Sacred prostitution existed, though not quite as later Greek sources described it. Temple women who embodied the goddess Inanna performed rituals that included sexuality as sacred act, as participation in divine fertility that would bless the land. Inanna herself, goddess of love, war, fertility, and the planet Venus, embodied paradoxes. She was beautiful and terrible, nurturing and destructive, desired and dangerous. Her mythology would grow to include one of the most profound stories in all Mesopotamian literature, but that comes later. For now, understand that she represented the Mesopotamian comfort with contradiction, with gods who contained multitudes who couldn't be reduced to single attributes. The underworld was established early too, as a necessary counterpart to the world of the living. Called Irkalla or Kur, it was ruled by Ereshkigal, Inanna's sister, and her consort Nergal. It wasn't quite hell. There was no punishment for sin there, no reward for virtue. Everyone went there regardless. It was a dusty, dark place where the dead ate clay and wore feathers, where they lived as shadows of themselves, neither tormented nor blessed, just diminished. This cosmology, heaven above, earth in the middle, underworld below, became the structure for understanding everything. Human society mirrored it. Kings in their palaces mirrored the gods in their temples. The social hierarchy, from king to priest to merchant to laborer, reflected cosmic order. And at the foundation of everything still was water. The Tigris and Euphrates, unpredictable and essential, remained the physical manifestation of Apsu and Tiamat. One defeated, one transformed, both still present, still powerful. The canals that humans dug, the irrigation that made civilization possible, These were acts of continuing creation, imposing order on chaos just as Marduk had done at the beginning. The Mesopotamian divine order wasn't established overnight. What we're looking at is a political theology that evolved as empires rose and fell, as one city conquered another, as priesthoods competed for influence and kings claimed legitimacy through different divine lineages. When the Sumerians dominated southern Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE, their pantheon reflected a world of city-states, each autonomous, each with its patron deity. Enlil of Nippur was respected as king of the gods, but he shared power, and of Uruk controlled heaven. Enki, later called Ea, of Eridu controlled the sweet waters and wisdom. Ninhursag was the mother goddess. Each had their domain, their sphere of influence, but power abhors a vacuum, and mythology abhors inconsistency. As political centralization happened, as stronger cities absorbed weaker ones, the mythology had to adapt. This is where we see something fascinating: theology following politics, or perhaps politics following theology, in a feedback loop that made divine mandate and earthly power inseparable. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon the Great around 2300 BCE represented the first true empire in human history. Multiple cities, multiple peoples united under one ruler. The Akkadians spoke a different language than the Sumerians, Semitic rather than the language isolate of Sumer. They needed a theology that could unite these different traditions. Their solution was syncretism. Akkadian gods absorbed Sumerian ones. Inanna became Ishtar, her personality amplified, her reach extended. Enki became Ea. The stories remained, but the names changed, and with the names, subtle shifts in character and emphasis. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1750 BCE, begins with a theological statement. Hammurabi describes himself as chosen by the gods to bring justice to the land. The laws themselves, 282 of them, carved in stone, aren't presented as his invention but as divine wisdom he's transmitting. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, becomes not just pragmatic legal principle but cosmic order made concrete. The stele shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god, god of justice. The message is clear. This isn't just political authority. This is cosmic authority. To violate these laws is to violate divine order itself. When Babylon became the dominant power under Hammurabi, Marduk's mythology expanded dramatically. The Enuma Elish, the epic we began with, was actually written or compiled during this period as a political document as much as a religious one. It explained why Marduk should be king of all gods, because he defeated chaos itself, because he created the universe, because he saved the other gods from destruction. Earlier versions of creation stories existed, featuring other gods in the hero role. But Babylon's version became canonical because Babylon had the power to make it so. They held the Akitu festival every spring, a 12-day celebration of Marduk's victory, during which the Enuma Elish was recited in full. Kings from conquered territories had to come to Babylon and participate, symbolically accepting Marduk's supremacy, and by extension, Babylon's political supremacy. This is how mythology consolidates power, through repetition, through ritual, through making the political order feel cosmically inevitable. You can't rebel against Marduk without rebelling against the very structure of reality. The role of the king evolved during this period too. Kings had always claimed divine favor, but now they claimed something more. They were the representatives of the gods on earth, the essential mediators between divine and human realms. Some kings, like the legendary Gilgamesh of Uruk, were said to be part divine themselves, born of goddess mothers and mortal fathers. Gilgamesh's story, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, shows us how mythology grappled with the limits even of semi-divine kingship. 2/3 god, 1/3 human, Gilgamesh was the mightiest king who ever lived. But when his beloved friend Enkidu died, Gilgamesh learned that even he couldn't escape mortality. His quest for immortality would fail. The gods had decided, at humanity's creation, that death would be our portion. Immortality belonged to the divine alone. This epic became a kind of wisdom literature, teaching that striving for what the gods had forbidden was futile. Better to accept your place, perform your duties, live fully within the bounds of mortal life. It was conservative theology, really designed to keep people from reaching too high, from disturbing the order. The priesthood during this consolidation period became increasingly sophisticated and powerful. They developed elaborate systems of divination, ways of reading the gods' will in everything from animal entrails to celestial movements. The Baru priests could examine a sacrificed sheep's liver and interpret dozens of features: the color, the shape of lobes, the presence of lesions. Each detail corresponded to potential futures, to divine warnings or approvals. Astronomical observation became priestly duty. The planets were gods. Jupiter was Marduk, Venus was Ishtar, Mars was Nergal. Their movements across the sky weren't random but meaningful messages that needed decoding. The Mesopotamians divided the zodiac into 12 signs, tracked celestial cycles with impressive accuracy, predicted eclipses. This wasn't science separated from religion. This was religion enabling systematic observation. The MUL.Appin tablets, astronomical compendiums from around 1000 BCE, listed stars and constellations, recorded rising and setting times, connected celestial events to agricultural calendars and ritual timing. When to plant, when to harvest, when to perform specific ceremonies, all determined by reading the sky as a divine text. Women's roles in this consolidation varied by city and period, but remained significant. The Nadata women, dedicated to gods like Shamash, lived in cloisters, managed property, conducted business, but never married or had children. They were brides of the gods, their property eventually reverting to temples. The Kadistu, associated with Ishtar, performed sacred sexual rites, embodying the goddess's fertility aspects. But consolidation also meant standardization, and standardization often meant restriction. As male priesthoods centralized power, some of the fluidity and diversity of earlier religious practice diminished. The great mother goddess traditions that may have been primary in the earliest periods became subordinate to male sky and storm gods. Still, goddesses like Ishtar retained immense power. She couldn't be fully controlled or domesticated because her mythology was too essential, her cult too widespread, her identification with the most visible planet too obvious. She represented an older layer of religious thought that newer systems had to accommodate rather than replace. The legal codes that emerged during this period, not just Hammurabi's but earlier ones like Uarnamu's, treated violations against temples and gods as the most serious crimes. Stealing from a temple wasn't just theft. It was cosmic disorder. False testimony before gods in a legal proceeding brought death. The entire legal system rested on the assumption that the gods witnessed oaths, punished perjury, demanded justice. This created a society where religion and law were truly inseparable. There was no secular sphere. Every contract invoked divine witnesses. Every trial assumed divine oversight. Every punishment was justified not just by social utility but by cosmic necessity. The consolidation of power, then, was fundamentally a consolidation of theological narrative. Make the mythology coherent, make it support political structure, make it explain why things are the way they are and why they shouldn't change. Use ritual to reinforce the message. Use priesthood to control access to divine favor. Use law to make religious obligation civic duty. And it worked. For thousands of years, this system held Mesopotamian civilization together through conquests, disasters, regime changes. Because when your gods are the foundation of reality itself, challenging the system means challenging reality. And who can do that? There are moments in history when everything seems to align, when human achievement reaches heights that make you wonder how our ancestors managed such brilliance with such limited tools. Mesopotamia experienced several such moments, but perhaps none more remarkable than the period we call the Neo-Assyrian Empire, roughly 911 to 609 BCE, and its successor the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II. Walk through Nineveh at its height under Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, and you'd find yourself in a city of perhaps 100,000 people, enormous by ancient standards. The palace complex covered acres, its walls covered in alabaster reliefs showing lion hunts, military campaigns, religious processions. These weren't crude scratchings but sophisticated art, muscles tensed, faces expressive, compositions dynamic. But the crown jewel of Ashurbanipal's palace was his library. He collected tablets obsessively, sending scribes throughout the empire to copy texts from older cities, from temple archives, from private collections. His agents reported back, "We have found the tablets you requested about magic rituals. We have copied the Omen series concerning lunar eclipses. We have acquired the Epic of Gilgamesh." When archaeologists excavated this library in the 1850s, they found over 30,000 tablets and fragments. This was the ancient world's most comprehensive collection of knowledge, medical texts describing symptoms and treatments, mathematical tablets solving complex problems, astronomical records tracking celestial phenomena across centuries, dictionaries translating Sumerian to Akkadian, literary works including multiple copies of the Gilgamesh epic, religious incantations, historical chronicles, legal documents. Ashurbanipal himself wrote, "I read the beautiful clay tablets from Sumer and the obscure Akkadian writing which is hard to master. I had my joy in the reading of inscriptions on stone from the time before the flood." A king who prided himself on literacy, who understood that power came not just from armies but from preserving and mastering knowledge. The temples during this period were more than religious centers, they were economic engines. The Asagila temple complex in Babylon owned vast estates, employed thousands, ran what amounted to banks and trading operations. Priests weren't just ritual performers but administrators, accountants, judges. The Temple of Ishtar in Uruk owned herds of cattle, fields of barley, workshops producing textiles and metalwork. This wealth funded spectacular religious festivals. The Akitu festival in Babylon lasted 12 days. The statue of Marduk was paraded through the city. The king ritually humbled himself before the god, symbolically dying and being reborn. Prisoners were released. Debts were forgiven. The entire city participated in reenacting creation, in affirming cosmic order, in celebrating their place in the divine plan. Daily life for ordinary people during these flourishing periods reflected this cosmic order in miniature. Your home had a small shrine to household gods. You prayed to personal deities, a god and goddess who specifically protected you and your family. You made offerings of bread and beer. You consulted diviners before important decisions. You named your children after gods. Nabu Shamishkin, Nabu has established a name. Ishtar Shum Eresh, Ishtar has desired a name. The beer was important, by the way. Mesopotamians were perhaps history's first serious brewers, with dozens of varieties. The hymn to Ninkasi, goddess of brewing, was simultaneously a religious text and a recipe, meant to be memorized by brewers. Beer was safer than water, nutritious, used as currency to pay workers, offered to gods. Temples employed professional brewers, and their beer was considered particularly fine because it was made under divine supervision. Women's status varied by class and period, but evidence shows women could own property, run businesses, initiate divorce, serve as witnesses in court. The Code of Hammurabi protected women's dowries and inheritance rights. Elite women could wield significant influence. Samaramat, whom Greeks later mythologized as Semiramis, served as regent of Assyria and may have led military campaigns. Education existed, though primarily for the elite and for those training as scribes. Students learned cuneiform by copying standard texts repeatedly, literary works, mathematical problems, religious incantations. They progressed from simple signs to complex compositions. Successful scribes could achieve significant status. Their profession was respected, well compensated, essential to administration and religion alike. The infrastructure supporting this civilization was remarkable. Networks of canals distributed water for irrigation, making agriculture possible in an arid climate. Cities had sophisticated drainage systems. The Assyrians built aqueducts, including the impressive Jerwin Aqueduct with its stone arches, bringing water from mountains to cities. Roads connected the empire, allowing rapid communication and trade. Trade routes stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. Mesopotamian merchants traveled far, returning with cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia. These materials weren't just commodities but divine gifts, each associated with particular gods, each carrying sacred significance. The art of this period shows increasing sophistication. Cylinder seals, small stones carved with intricate scenes, rolled across clay to create impressions, became miniature masterpieces. Each seal was unique, serving as signature and amulet combined. The scenes depicted everything from mythological narratives to peaceful pastoral settings, from demon-fighting heroes to intimate human moments. Metalwork achieved extraordinary refinement. The gold treasures from Uar's royal tombs show incredible craftsmanship, delicate earrings, elaborate crowns, musical instruments decorated with gold and lapis lazuli. Jewelry wasn't just ornamental but protective, often inscribed with prayers or the names of protective deities. Musical culture flourished. Temples employed professional musicians. The 11-stringed lyre was particularly important, associated with cosmic harmony. Hymns were composed with specific musical notations. Music accompanied rituals, work, celebrations, mourning. It was another way of maintaining cosmic order, another form of worship. Gardens were sacred spaces. The famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, if they actually existed, evidence is debated, would have been a theological statement as much as an engineering marvel. Gardens represented restored paradise, the divine order imposed on wild nature, the abundance gods could provide when properly served. Medical knowledge was surprisingly advanced, though mixed with magic and religion. Physicians could identify symptoms, prescribe treatments including surgery, set bones, perform dental work. But they also invoked healing gods, performed rituals, attributed illness to demonic possession or divine displeasure. The best medicine combined practical treatment with spiritual intervention. The mathematics of this period still influences us. The Mesopotamian base 60 number system gave us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. They could solve quadratic equations, calculate compound interest, determine areas and volumes. This wasn't abstract theory but practical math for building, surveying, accounting, astronomy. And the astronomy was genuinely impressive. Babylonian astronomers could predict lunar eclipses years in advance. They tracked planetary movements with remarkable accuracy. They developed mathematical models of celestial mechanics that wouldn't be surpassed until the Greek period. This knowledge was sacred knowledge, understanding the movements of gods across the sky, reading divine intentions in cosmic patterns. Literature flourished beyond the great epics. Wisdom literature offered practical and philosophical guidance. Love poetry celebrated beauty and desire with surprising frankness. Lamentations mourned destroyed cities with genuine pathos. Prayer collections addressed gods with intimacy and desperation, bargaining, pleading, praising. This was civilization at its peak. Not perfect, not equal, not just, but functioning at a level of complexity and achievement that wouldn't be matched in the region again for over 1,000 years after its fall. And running through everything, giving meaning to everything, was the mythology we're exploring. The gods weren't abstractions but active participants in daily life, determining success or failure, demanding service, providing protection, making the universe comprehensible. Let me take you inside a Mesopotamian temple on an ordinary day, because that's where you'll understand how mythology translated into daily practice, how cosmic order became routine, how the divine and mundane interwove seamlessly. Before dawn, priests performed the purification rituals. They bathed in sacred water drawn from temple wells. They dressed in clean linen robes. They recited prayers older than memory, passed down through generations of priests, precisely worded because precision mattered. One wrong word could invalidate the entire ritual. The god, represented by a statue in the inner sanctum, had to be awakened. Yes, awakened. The statue wasn't a symbol of the god. It was understood as the actual dwelling place of divine presence. The god slept at night and had to be roused with morning hymns. The curtains around the statue were drawn back. Offerings of bread and beer were placed before it, along with fresh water for washing. Then the god was clothed, different garments for different seasons, for different festivals. The statue was anointed with fragrant oils, adorned with jewelry. Breakfast was served, multiple courses actually, including meat, fruits, and elaborate pastries. The god didn't physically eat, of course, but the essence of the food was consumed by divine presence, and afterward the physical offerings became the property of the priesthood. This happened every single day. Miss a day, and cosmic order began to unravel. The gods might withdraw their protection. Disasters might follow. The rituals maintained the contract between divine and human realms. Beyond the central temple were specialized priests for specific functions. The Kalu priests performed lamentation rituals, singing mourning songs even during normal times to prevent future disasters through anticipatory grief. The Baru priests examined animal organs for omens. The Asapu priests performed exorcisms and protective magic. The Masmesu priests specialized in purification rituals. Each position required years of training, mastery of written texts, memorization of hundreds of incantations and prayers. This was professionalism in the truest sense, skilled labor requiring specialized knowledge, organized into hierarchies paid from temple resources. The economy ran through temples. Farmers brought portions of their harvest as offerings and taxes. The two were essentially identical. The temple distributed these resources to priests and temple workers, to the poor during festivals to fund public works. Temples loaned out seed grain, charged interest, kept meticulous records on clay tablets. A typical transaction tablet might read, 1 shekel of silver, loan of Shamash from Nabu Shamishkan, to be repaid at harvest with 20% interest. Witnessed by names, sealed in the presence of Shamash. The god was both creditor and witness. Default wasn't just breach of contract but religious offense. Legal cases were heard in temple courtyards. Parties swore oaths before divine statues. Lies before the gods brought divine punishment. Not just afterlife consequences but immediate disaster. This created a truth enforcement mechanism more powerful than any police force. You could lie to people, but lying before your god meant risking everything. The river ordeal was an extreme form of divine judgment. If evidence was insufficient, the accused could be thrown into the river. If they survived, the river god had judged them innocent. If they drowned, guilty. It sounds barbaric until you understand the logic. The river god Ea knew truth absolutely. His judgment was infallible. Human judges were fallible, but divine judges never erred. Agricultural life ran on sacred calendars. Each month had its patron deity, its prescribed rituals, its taboo days when certain activities were forbidden. Farmers consulted almanacs that combined agricultural advice with religious observance. In the month of Nisanu, when Marduk establishes the year, prepare your tools. Perform the ritual for the plow. Make offerings to Ningirsu. Do not begin planting on an unlucky day. The intercalary system kept the lunar calendar aligned with solar seasons by occasionally adding an extra month. This decision wasn't astronomical but religious. Priests determined when the calendar had drifted too far and declared an additional month, often the month of Oyalu, to reset the cycle. Family life was thoroughly integrated with religious practice. Marriages required divine blessing. Barren couples made pilgrimages to fertility shrines. Sick children were dedicated to healing deities with vows. If you heal my son, he will serve in your temple. Birth, naming ceremonies, coming of age, all marked with appropriate rituals and offerings. Names themselves were theological statements. Rimsin meant bull of sin, the moon god. Dursharakan meant fortress of Sargon. Amel Marduk meant man of Marduk. Your name identified which god protected you, which city you came from, what your parents hoped you'd become. Changing names sometimes accompanied major life changes or divine interventions. The professional scribe class operated both within temples and independently. Scribes drafted contracts, wrote letters, kept accounts, composed literary works, copied ancient texts. Their training included mathematics, languages. Sumerian remained a scholarly language long after it died as a spoken tongue, law, and of course the intricacies of cuneiform script. A competent scribe needed to know thousands of signs, including logograms, signs representing words, syllabic signs, representing sounds, and determinatives, signs indicating categories. The same sign could have multiple readings depending on context. Mastery took years of practice, copying standard texts until muscle memory took over. Royal administration depended entirely on literate bureaucrats. Provincial governors reported to the king using standardized forms. In the province of Name, the following taxes were collected, the following public works completed, the following crimes prosecuted. Kings responded with written commands, creating paper trails, clay trails technically, that archaeologists still study today. The military also integrated religious practice. Soldiers fought under divine banners, literally carrying standards topped with divine symbols. Before battle, diviners examined omens to determine divine favor. After victory, temples received substantial portions of plunder. Defeated enemy god statues were sometimes captured and held hostage, literally, in Assyrian or Babylonian temples, their cities unable to receive divine protection until the statues were returned. Trade caravans departed with prayers and returned with thank offerings. Merchants had patron deities who protected them on dangerous journeys. Successful merchants endowed temples with portions of their profits. Business partnerships invoked divine witnesses just like legal contracts. Even crime and punishment reflected theological order. Theft from a temple brought death. Murder required blood compensation to the victim's family and purification rituals to cleanse the community of blood pollution. Adultery violated sacred marriage bonds and required divine expiation. Civil disputes might be resolved through compensation, but crimes against the cosmic order demanded more severe responses. The poor had some protection within this system. During festivals, temples distributed food and wealth. Laws required leaving grain in the fields for gleaning. Widows and orphans had special status. Harming them brought particularly severe divine punishment because they had no human protectors and thus were under the gods' direct protection. Public works projects, canal dredging, wall building, road construction, were organized as corvée labor, a tax paid in work rather than goods. But these projects began with religious ceremonies, proceeded under priestly supervision, and concluded with Thanksgiving festivals. Even manual labor was sacred service, maintaining the civilization that honored the gods. This system was comprehensive, totalizing even. There was no separation between sacred and secular because the concept didn't exist. Every action had theological significance. Every institution served religious purposes. The gods weren't distant abstractions but active participants in daily life, to be consulted, pleased, feared, and honored in every transaction, every decision, every moment. In 539 BCE, Babylon was the wonder of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar II had rebuilt it into something that made contemporaries struggle for adequate language to describe what they were seeing. Herodotus, visiting later, wrote descriptions that other Greeks didn't quite believe, thinking he must be exaggerating. He wasn't. The outer walls of Babylon stretched for miles, wide enough that a chariot with 4 horses could turn around on top of them. The Ishtar Gate, covered in glazed blue bricks depicting dragons and bulls in yellow and white, led into the city through a processional way similarly decorated. Walking through that gate, you entered a city of perhaps 200,000 people, the largest metropolis on earth at that time. The Ziggurat Etemenanke, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose in 7 levels to about 300 feet. Its name would later inspire the biblical Tower of Babel story, but the reality needed no embellishment. This was a mountain built by human hands, each level painted a different color representing cosmic realms, with Marduk's temple at the summit where heaven and earth met. Nebuchadnezzar didn't just build monuments to power. He commissioned the Babylonian map of the world, one of the oldest known world maps, showing Babylon at the center of a disk surrounded by ocean, with other known lands arranged around it, literally placing Babylon at the center of existence. This wasn't arrogance so much as theological geography. Of course, the city of Marduk, king of gods, must be the center. The astronomical knowledge accumulated by this period was staggering. Babylonian astronomers had centuries of recorded observations. They could predict not just lunar eclipses but the complex movements of planets with mathematical precision. The Mul.Appin tablets and later the astronomical diaries recorded celestial phenomena in detail that would inform Greek and later Islamic astronomy. What they created was mathematical astronomy, using numerical relationships to predict celestial events without necessarily understanding physical causes. They didn't know planets orbited the sun, but their mathematical models worked. They calculated synodic periods, the time between successive appearances of a planet in the same position relative to the sun, accurate to remarkable degrees. This knowledge was sacred knowledge. The gods moved in the sky according to divine order, and understanding that order meant understanding divine intention. But it was also practical knowledge used for planting cycles, for flood predictions, for timing festivals. Sacred and practical weren't separate categories. The literary achievement of this period is harder to quantify but equally impressive. The standard Babylonian version of the Gilgamesh epic was finalized, polished, copied extensively. This wasn't just a story but a meditation on mortality, friendship, the limits of human achievement, the acceptance of death. It's arguably humanity's first great work of literature, grappling with themes that still resonate today. The mythology itself reached its most sophisticated formulation. The creation epic Enuma Elish existed in multiple copies. The Atrahasis epic, telling an alternate creation story including a great flood, was widely known. The descent of Ishtar to the underworld, perhaps the most psychologically complex myth in the Mesopotamian corpus, explored death, resurrection, the relationship between sisters, the sacrifice required for rebirth. Let me tell you that story briefly, because it shows the pinnacle of Mesopotamian mythological thinking. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, decided to descend to the underworld, the realm ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. Why? The texts offer no clear explanation, which is part of the story's power. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps obligation, perhaps inevitability. She approached the 7 gates of the underworld. At each gate, she had to remove one item of clothing or jewelry. Her crown at the first gate, her earrings at the second, her necklace, her breast ornaments, her girdle, her bracelets, finally her robe. She arrived before Ereshkigal naked and powerless. Ereshkigal killed her, hung her corpse on a hook. Above, in the world of the living, everything ceased. No sexual desire, no reproduction, no growth. Creation itself was dying because the goddess of fertility was dead. The gods sent a messenger to negotiate. Ereshkigal agreed to release Ishtar, but only if someone took her place. Ishtar returned to life and found her consort Dumuzi hadn't been mourning her but sitting on a throne, enjoying her power. Enraged, she sent him to the underworld as her substitute. His sister Jeshtanana offered to share his fate, spending half the year in the underworld while he lived above, then trading places. This cycle explained the agricultural year, fertility and barrenness, growth and death, eternally alternating. This myth operates on multiple levels. It's agricultural allegory, yes, explaining seasons. But it's also about the necessity of death for life, about descent and resurrection, about what must be sacrificed to maintain cosmic order, about the complexity of female power and female relationships. It's sophisticated theology wrapped in gripping narrative. The institutions supporting this cultural pinnacle were vast. The Temple of Asagila in Babylon employed thousands. Priests of various ranks, musicians, craftsmen, administrators, guards, cleaners, cooks preparing divine meals. It owned farmland across southern Mesopotamia, controlled trade networks, functioned as a bank lending silver at interest, maintained schools for scribal training. The king himself participated directly in religious life, not as distant figurehead but as active intermediary. During the New Year's Akitu festival, Nebuchadnezzar would enter the temple, stripped of his regalia, and kneel before Marduk's priest. The priest would slap him, pull his ears, make him recite, "I have not sinned, Lord of the countries. I have not been negligent regarding your godship." This ritual humiliation of the most powerful man in the world affirmed that even kings served the gods. Power was delegated, conditional, revocable. Then the king's regalia would be returned, symbolizing his renewal, and he would lead Marduk's statue through the city while the creation epic was recited, while prisoners were released, while the social order temporarily inverted before being restored. The city's diversity during this period was remarkable. Babylon was cosmopolitan in the truest sense, Jews lived there after their exile in 586 BCE, maintaining their traditions while absorbing Mesopotamian learning. Persians, Egyptians, Greeks, Arabs moved through as merchants, diplomats, mercenaries. The city had neighborhoods organized by ethnicity and profession. Multiple languages echoed through its markets. This diversity enriched the mythology. Jewish exilic literature absorbed Mesopotamian themes. The Genesis flood narrative shows clear influence from Atrahasis and the Gilgamesh epic. The week of creation in Genesis echoes the structured cosmos of Enuma Elish. The Jewish apocalyptic tradition borrowed Mesopotamian imagery of cosmic battles and divine councils. The Persian influence would come later, but already there was exchange. Zoroastrian dualism, the cosmic battle between good and evil, would interact with Mesopotamian mythology's more complex view of gods who contained both beneficent and destructive aspects. These weren't separate, sealed systems but living traditions influencing each other. The visual arts reached extraordinary sophistication. The Ishtar gates glazed bricks required advanced kiln technology. The reliefs in Nebuchadnezzar's palace showed not just technical skill but artistic vision. Compositions balanced, figures dynamic, details precise. These weren't primitive cult objects but high art created by master craftsmen who understood proportion, perspective, movement. Music and poetry were performed professionally. Court musicians composed hymns for specific occasions. Professional lamenters maintained traditions of ritual mourning that stretched back millennia. The oral tradition remained strong even as writing preserved it. Poems were meant to be heard, rhythms felt, refrains repeated. The educational system produced truly learned individuals. Scribes might master mathematics, astronomy, literature, law, medicine, multiple languages. The curriculum preserved ancient Sumerian texts alongside contemporary Akkadian works. Students learned by copying, but the best students also learned to compose, to solve new problems, to extend the tradition while preserving it. Women's status at this pinnacle is harder to assess than we'd like. Elite women could be literate, own property, engage in business. Temple women held significant ritual roles. Queens like Nebuchadnezzar's wife, for whom the Hanging Gardens were supposedly built, could wield considerable influence. But systematic legal equality didn't exist. Women's rights were real but circumscribed. The mythology itself contained powerful female deities, Ishtar, Ereshkigal, Tiamat, Ninhursag, who weren't mere consorts but independent actors with their own agency, desires, and spheres of power. This theological acknowledgement of female power didn't automatically translate into social equality, but it created conceptual space for recognizing women's importance. The pinnacle wasn't just material achievement but ideological coherence. The system made sense internally. The myths explained origin and purpose. The rituals maintained cosmic order. The laws enforced divine justice. The administration distributed resources according to theological principles. Everything interlocked, each piece supporting the others. When Babylonian ambassadors visited other kingdoms, they came as representatives not just of a political power but of a civilization. They brought scribes who could write in multiple languages, astronomers who could predict eclipses, priests who could perform elaborate rituals, craftsmen who could create objects of stunning beauty. They embodied the pinnacle of human achievement as the ancient world understood it. But pinnacles are precarious. The very height makes the fall more dramatic. And already subtle cracks were forming in the foundation. The irony is that Babylon fell not to military defeat but to peaceful conquest. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia entered the city without a battle. The Babylonian army had already been defeated elsewhere, and the population apparently welcomed the change. Some sources suggest the priests of Marduk actually invited Cyrus in, unhappy with the previous king Nabonidus. Nabonidus was the crack that started the unraveling. He was obsessed with the moon god Sin rather than Marduk. He spent years in Arabia rather than performing the crucial New Year's rituals in Babylon. He neglected the Akitu festival, the symbolic renewal of divine kingship. To the priesthood, this wasn't just political neglect, it was cosmic disorder. When a king fails to honor the gods properly, what happens to the contract between divine and human realms? The mythology said disasters should follow. And they did. Babylon lost its empire. But not through divine punishment directly. Through the very human consequence of alienating the powerful priesthood that legitimized royal authority. Cyrus understood this brilliantly. He presented himself as Marduk's chosen instrument, sent to restore proper worship. He performed the rituals Nabonidus had neglected. He honored Babylonian gods while maintaining his own Persian religion. He allowed exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return home. The Cyrus Cylinder, a clay foundation document, proclaims his divinely mandated mission to bring peace and proper religious observance. The Persians didn't destroy Mesopotamian culture. They preserved it while subordinating it. Babylon remained an important city, but no longer the capital of empire. The center of power had shifted, and with political power went cultural vitality. But the deeper crack was intellectual. Babylonian astronomy had become so sophisticated, so predictive, that it began to challenge mythological explanations. When you can calculate celestial movements mathematically, when you can predict eclipses years in advance, the idea that planets are gods becomes complicated. The astronomers didn't abandon religious interpretation. They maintained that celestial phenomena were omens, divine messages. But the mechanical predictability suggested an ordered cosmos that operated according to fixed laws rather than divine whim. This tension between mathematical order and theological meaning would eventually contribute to the development of natural philosophy. Greek contact accelerated this tension. Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BCE, and suddenly Greek philosophers were encountering Babylonian learning. They were impressed, especially by the astronomical records, the mathematical sophistication, the depth of accumulated knowledge. But Greeks thought differently about gods. Their mythology was rich in narrative but less rigidly connected to cosmic order. Greek philosophers like Aristotle were developing naturalistic explanations for phenomena Mesopotamians attributed to divine action. When these systems met, they transformed each other, but the transformation wasn't equal. Greek thought would eventually dominate. The economic system showed cracks too. The temple-centered economy worked when temples had divine authority backing their financial operations. But under Persian and later Seleucid rule, secular administrative systems began to parallel and eventually supersede temple administration. Taxes went to distant imperial capitals. Trade routes shifted. The economic power that sustained the religious establishment eroded. Languages shifted. Aramaic, more practical than cuneiform, became the administrative language of the Persian Empire. It was alphabetic, you could learn it in weeks rather than years. Cuneiform continued in scholarly and religious contexts, but increasingly it was a specialized skill rather than necessary for conducting business or legal affairs. This might seem like a technical change, but language shapes thought. Cuneiform connected scribes directly to millennia of tradition. When you learned to write, you learned by copying ancient texts, absorbing ancient worldviews. Aramaic, pragmatic and efficient, severed that automatic transmission of tradition. The mythology itself faced internal contradictions that became harder to ignore. Multiple creation stories existed with conflicting details. Different cities preserved incompatible versions of divine genealogies. God's characters and relationships varied between texts. When these were oral traditions maintained by separate temple communities, inconsistencies didn't matter much. When preserved in writing, compared side by side, they created questions. Scholars tried to harmonize these contradictions through commentary and explanation, but the very need to explain revealed that the system wasn't as coherent as it had seemed. The mythology had evolved over 3,000 years, accumulating layers that didn't quite fit together. At the pinnacle, this appeared as richness and complexity. In decline, it appeared as confusion. Natural disasters contributed to the sense of divine withdrawal. The Tigris and Euphrates changed courses over centuries, leaving ancient cities stranded without water. Salinization from centuries of irrigation made farmland less productive. Climate shifts may have contributed to drought. These were normal geological and environmental processes, but they felt like divine abandonment. Cities that had thrived for millennia began their slow decline. Once magnificent, gradually emptied. Uruk, legendary city of Gilgamesh, shrank. Nippur, sacred city of Enlil, became a backwater. The temples continued functioning, but with fewer resources, smaller staffs, diminished influence. The priesthood itself fragmented. Different temples competed for resources and authority. Astronomical observation continued, but now astronomers might work for Greek patrons as much as Babylonian temples. Scribes found employment in imperial administration rather than purely religious service. The unified system of religious authority that had sustained the mythology fractured into competing interests. Military defeats, though not as dramatic as total conquest, accumulated psychologically. Assyria, which had dominated the region with brutal efficiency, fell to combined Babylonian and Median forces in 612 BCE. The Babylonian Empire itself lasted less than a century before Persian conquest. The narrative of divine protection and destined supremacy became harder to maintain when empires kept falling. Jewish exilic literature began offering alternative narratives. The Book of Daniel, written during this period, though set earlier, presented Babylonian power as temporary, divinely ordained to fall. Jewish prophets interpreted their own exile as divine punishment but also divine plan, promising eventual restoration. This counter-narrative challenged Mesopotamian theological supremacy even as it borrowed Mesopotamian imagery and themes. The cracks were subtle at first. The system still functioned. Temples still performed rituals. Kings still claimed divine mandate. Astronomers still read omens. But the unquestioned authority, the sense that this was the only way to understand cosmos and society, had weakened. And once people begin questioning, once alternatives become thinkable, institutions that depended on unquestioned acceptance face existential challenges. By the time the Seleucid Empire controlled Mesopotamia after 312 BCE, following Alexander's conquests, Babylon was becoming a museum of its own past. Greek colonists lived in new quarters built alongside ancient temples. Greek became the language of administration and commerce, relegating Akkadian to religious and scholarly contexts. The mythology that had shaped civilization for 3 millennia was becoming exotic lore. The unraveling wasn't dramatic. No one burned the temples or banned the old gods. Instead, something more insidious happened. The mythology became optional. You could be successful, educated, prosperous without participating in the old religious system. And once religion becomes optional, its authority is fundamentally compromised. Cuneiform writing declined sharply. Why spend years learning thousands of complex signs when you could learn the Aramaic alphabet in weeks? By the 1st century BCE, the number of people who could read cuneiform had shrunk to a small priestly class in a handful of temples. When those priests died without successors, millennia of literature became instantly unreadable. The last known cuneiform text was written in 75 CE, an astronomical diary. Think about that. Nearly 3.5 millennia of continuous writing tradition ended not with a bang but with the final entry in an observation log. After that, silence. The voices that had spoken in cuneiform fell mute. The temples fought to maintain relevance. They adapted, incorporating Greek astronomical knowledge into their observations, accepting Greek names for celestial bodies while maintaining Babylonian calculation methods. They offered their services to Greek rulers, providing astrological predictions for military campaigns and personal decisions. But they were no longer the authoritative voices defining reality. They were specialists offering one service among many. Religious syncretism accelerated. Greek settlers identified Babylonian gods with Greek equivalents. Marduk became Zeus, Ishtar became Aphrodite or Artemis, Nabu became Apollo. This wasn't necessarily disrespectful, but it subordinated Mesopotamian theology to Greek categories. The rich specificity of Mesopotamian mythology, Marduk as creator who defeated Tiamat as patron of Babylon, as holder of the Tablet of Destinies, collapsed into simple functional equivalence with Zeus. The great festivals continued but transformed. The Akitu festival still happened, but now Greek tourists might attend as exotic spectacle rather than cosmic necessity. The rituals were performed, but their meaning had shifted from maintaining universal order to maintaining local tradition. Economic changes accelerated the unraveling. As temple landholdings decreased, as trade routes shifted toward coastal cities rather than inland Mesopotamia, as taxes funded Greek cities and Hellenistic armies rather than ziggurats and divine offerings, the material basis for the old system eroded. Fewer priests could be supported, fewer scribes trained, fewer texts copied. The intellectual tradition faced a brain drain. Talented young people increasingly learned Greek, studied Greek philosophy, pursued careers in the Hellenistic world rather than Mesopotamian temple service. The astronomical knowledge Babylonians had accumulated was valuable, so it was translated and absorbed into Greek science. But the religious context was left behind. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing around 290 BCE, composed a history of Babylon in Greek for Greek audiences. He included creation myths, flood narratives, king lists, preserving Mesopotamian tradition while translating it into Greek intellectual categories. His work shows the desperation of the situation. To be heard, to be taken seriously, you had to write in Greek for Greek readers according to Greek literary conventions. The mythology itself underwent a subtle transformation. The stories that survived were those that fit Greek narrative preferences. Dramatic, morally instructive, featuring individual heroes. More complex theological texts, ritual instructions, priestly commentaries, these interested Greek audiences less, so they were copied less, transmitted less, and ultimately lost more completely. Natural environmental decline continued. The irrigation systems built over millennia required constant maintenance, organized labor, central coordination. As political authority fragmented, as resources decreased, maintenance failed. Canals silted up. Salt accumulated in fields. Agricultural productivity declined. Population decreased. Cities shrank. This created a vicious cycle. Fewer people meant less tax revenue, less labor for maintenance, less economic surplus to support temples and priests. Declining temple resources meant fewer rituals, less impressive festivals, diminished authority. Diminished authority meant less adherence to old ways, more acceptance of new alternatives. The Parthian conquest in 141 BCE brought another layer of displacement. The Parthians had their own cultural traditions, their own administrative systems. Mesopotamia became a border region between Parthian and Roman spheres of influence, fought over, occupied alternately, never stable enough for cultural flourishing. Christianity began spreading through the region in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, offering a different theological system, monotheistic, focused on personal salvation, promise of afterlife reward rather than shadowy underworld existence, accessible without elaborate temple ritual or priestly mediation. For people living in declining cities with failing temple systems, Christianity offered hope and community. The old gods didn't die dramatically, they faded. Rituals continued but with less frequency, less understanding of original meaning. Myths were remembered but as quaint stories rather than sacred truth. The astronomical knowledge divorced from religious interpretation, becoming technical rather than theological. Some traditions persisted in unexpected ways. Mandeism, a Gnostic religion still practiced today by a small community, preserves some Mesopotamian elements. Ritual purification in running water, a complex cosmology of celestial beings, baptismal practices. Whether these are direct survivals or later borrowings is debated, but they show how fragments could persist even as the whole system collapsed. Magic and divination proved more resilient than official religion. People still wanted to know the future, still sought protection from demons and diseases, still believed in the power of incantations. So those practical elements of Mesopotamian religious life continued in folk practice long after temple religion died. Modified, corrupted, blended with other traditions but recognizable. The libraries, those repositories of accumulated knowledge, met various fates. Some were deliberately destroyed in wars. Some collapsed as their buildings deteriorated. Many were simply abandoned as scribes who could read them died without successors. The tablets survived physically. Clay is remarkably durable, but became meaningless artifacts, their messages locked inside until modern archaeology developed the keys. By 200 CE, active worship of the old Mesopotamian gods had essentially ceased. A few isolated temples might have continued, a few priests maintaining traditions they barely understood, but the living tradition was dead. The last speakers of Akkadian fell silent. The last readers of Cuneiform passed away. The last people who understood Marduk as their personal protector, who experienced Ishtar as immediate divine presence, who felt the cosmic significance of temple ritual, they disappeared. And with them, 3,000 years of religious experience ended. There's no single moment you can point to and say, here is where Mesopotamian mythology died. But if we must choose a symbolic breaking point, consider this. Sometime in the late 3rd or early 4th century CE, the last temple in Babylon closed its doors. The exact date is lost to history, which is fitting. The end came not with dramatic finality but with quiet fading. The temple might have been the Asagila, Marduk's great temple, though we can't be certain. What we know is that by the 4th century CE, when Christian and Manichaean sources describe Babylon, they mention only ruins. The Ziggurat at Etemenanke had crumbled into a massive brick pile. The processional way was buried under wind-blown sand. The glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate had been scavenged for other construction projects. The city itself was dying. The population that had peaked at perhaps 200,000 under Nebuchadnezzar had dwindled to maybe a few thousand living among ruins they couldn't maintain, scavenging bricks from ancient palaces to build modest homes. The Euphrates had shifted course slightly over centuries, changing the geography of the city, making ancient layouts obsolete. Imagine being among the last priests. You've inherited texts you can barely read, maintaining rituals whose meaning you incompletely understand, serving gods your neighbors have abandoned for Christ or Mani or simply for pragmatic indifference. You perform the dawn rituals alone, your voice echoing in vast halls designed for crowds. The offerings are meager because donations have dried up. The building itself is decaying, you can't afford repairs. Why continue? Perhaps duty. Perhaps the hope that the gods will return favor if you just maintain the contract. Perhaps fear of what might happen if the rituals completely cease. But eventually, inevitably, you stop. You close the doors for the last time. You walk away, and no one replaces you. For the people experiencing this transition, it wasn't necessarily traumatic. Most had already shifted their primary religious affiliation to newer traditions. The old temples were familiar parts of the landscape, like ancient trees, but not personally vital. When they closed, it was sad perhaps in the way any ending is sad, but not devastating. The breaking point was environmental as much as cultural. The irrigation systems that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for millennia finally collapsed beyond repair. Salinization from centuries of irrigation had rendered much farmland unproductive. The political will and resources needed to maintain canals and dikes didn't exist. Natural river course changes stranded cities that had depended on waterways for transport and agriculture. This created a cascading failure. Agricultural decline meant less food surplus, smaller populations, fewer resources for everything including religion. Population decline meant less labor to maintain infrastructure, creating further agricultural decline. The cycle fed on itself until the entire system of urban civilization that had defined Mesopotamia collapsed. Cities like Ur and Uruk were gradually abandoned. Centuries of wind-blown sand buried streets and temples. Buildings collapsed and were not rebuilt. Within a few hundred years, these legendary cities were tells, artificial hills created by millennia of urban occupation, now empty, their names remembered in legend but their locations forgotten. The breaking point had psychological dimensions too. When Christianity became the Roman Empire's official religion in the 4th century, it wasn't just another option among many. It was actively promoted, often at the expense of older traditions. Temples throughout the empire, including Mesopotamia's remnants, were converted to churches, destroyed, or left to decay. The Christian narrative explained this transition theologically. The old gods were demons or false idols. Their worship had been allowed temporarily but was now superseded by truth. This wasn't just religious conversion but epistemological replacement. An entirely different way of understanding reality, history, and humanity's place in cosmos. For people raised with Mesopotamian cosmology, this required fundamental reorientation. The universe wasn't created from Tiamat's corpse but by a single god speaking words. Humanity wasn't created from clay and rebel God's blood to serve divine needs, but in God's image with dignity and purpose. Death didn't mean shadowy underworld existence, but judgment followed by heaven or hell. History wasn't cyclical cosmic maintenance, but linear movement toward apocalyptic culmination. These weren't minor adjustments, but complete worldview transformations. And for a while, both systems existed in the same minds. People might accept Christian salvation theology while still half believing in old protective amulets, might pray to Christ while avoiding days the old calendar marked as unlucky. But over generations, the old system lost even this residual hold. The astronomical tradition survived longer than the mythology, but transformed. Babylonian mathematical methods for predicting planetary positions were absorbed into Greek and later Islamic astronomy. But the interpretation changed. Planets weren't gods, but celestial bodies following mathematical laws. The observations continued, but the meaning shifted from theology to natural philosophy. The breaking point for the mythology as lived religion was probably earlier than the last temple closure. Perhaps when the last generation that had been raised believing Marduk actually controlled cosmic order passed away. After that, you had people who knew the stories, who might respect the traditions, but who didn't genuinely experience the gods as real, active presences in their lives. This is the quiet death of a religion. Not persecution, not forced conversion, but slow irrelevance. The stories become folklore. The rituals become empty forms. The temples become historical curiosities. The gods become characters in old stories rather than powers you fear and worship. The written tradition had already broken. The last cuneiform texts dated to the 1st century CE. After that, no new texts were produced. The existing texts gradually became unreadable as knowledge of the script vanished. Libraries of tablets sat in temple ruins, their contents locked away, their messages silent. When Islamic armies conquered the region in the 7th century CE, they found desert punctuated by mysterious mounds. Local populations had folk memories that these were ancient cities, but specific knowledge was gone. Arabic chroniclers recorded confused legends mixing biblical narratives with corrupted memories of Mesopotamian stories, but the living connection to the original culture had been severed. The breaking point, then, was less a moment than a threshold. On one side, Mesopotamian mythology was a living religious system actively shaping how people understood reality. On the other side, it was lost knowledge, dead tradition, archaeological puzzle. The crossing took centuries, but once crossed, there was no returning. The gods who had created the universe, who had survived since before time, who had demanded service and given protection for 3,000 years, they fell silent. Not because they were defeated or disproven, but because the last people who heard their voices died without successors. When archaeologist Austin Henry Layard uncovered Nineveh's ruins in 1845, he found Ashurbanipal's library chambers filled with thousands of clay tablets, many remarkably preserved. But here's the haunting part. No one could read them. The cuneiform script had been incomprehensible for nearly 2 millennia. These voices from the ancient world were literally speaking, but we'd forgotten how to listen. What remained of Mesopotamian mythology existed in 3 forms: physical artifacts we couldn't interpret, corrupted echoes in other traditions, and complete silence where knowledge had been irretrievably lost. The physical remains were extensive but mute. Ziggurats stood as crumbling brick mountains. Locals called them Burs Nimrud or similar names, connecting them to Nimrod or other biblical figures, not understanding their original purpose or dedication. Cylinder seals turned up in farmers' fields, beautiful but meaningless. Tablets by the thousands lay in ruined buildings, their messages locked inside. The real preservation happened accidentally. When enemies burned Mesopotamian cities, they inadvertently fired the clay tablets, making them nearly indestructible. Libraries that might have crumbled to dust if left alone became permanent time capsules. The very violence that ended the civilization helped preserve its voice. But preservation isn't the same as transmission. The tablets remained, but understanding vanished. For 2,000 years, the greatest literature, the most sophisticated astronomy, the foundational myths of Western civilization sat underground or in crumbling walls, completely inaccessible. What did survive in recognizable form? Fragments, echoes, shadows. The flood myth survived most completely, absorbed into both biblical and classical traditions. Genesis preserves a version clearly influenced by the Atrahasis epic and the flood narrative in Gilgamesh. Noah builds an ark, saves animals and his family, sends out birds to find land, receives divine promise. All elements present in the much older Mesopotamian Utnapishtim story. The Hebrew version is transformed, made monotheistic, given different theological meaning, but the narrative structure is recognizably Mesopotamian. Greek sources preserved fragments too, though often confused or rationalized. Berossus's History of Babylon, written in Greek, was lost entirely but was quoted by later authors like Josephus and Eusebius. Through these quotations of quotations, bits of Mesopotamian mythology survived: creation stories, king lists, flood narratives, but removed from context, mixed with Greek interpretations sometimes barely recognizable. The Jewish apocalyptic tradition absorbed Mesopotamian imagery extensively. Daniel's visions of cosmic beasts, angelic hierarchies, celestial battles. These draw heavily on Mesopotamian mythological motifs, even while inverting their meaning. The Jewish exiles in Babylon absorbed the cosmic drama and divine council imagery but recast it in monotheistic terms. Astrology preserved Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge but severed it from original religious context. The zodiac, the assignment of divine qualities to planets, the interpretation of celestial phenomena as omens, all Mesopotamian innovations. But Greek and later Roman astrology transformed these into something new, mixing Mesopotamian calculation methods with Greek philosophy and Egyptian divine associations. Some elements passed into Islamic tradition. Medieval Arabic scholars knew vaguely about ancient Mesopotamian knowledge. They associated Babylon with magic and forbidden wisdom. The Quranic story of the angels Harut and Marut teaching magic in Babylon preserves a memory of Mesopotamian magical traditions, though completely recontextualized. Mandeism, practiced today by perhaps 60,000 to 100,000 people mostly in Iraq and Iran, may preserve Mesopotamian elements. Their ritual focus on living water, complex angelology, and certain mythological motifs have possible connections to ancient Mesopotamian religion. But the connections are debated, and even if real, they represent fragments absorbed into a completely different religious system. Christian Gnosticism, flourishing in the early centuries CE in the region, borrowed cosmological structures from Mesopotamian mythology. Multiple celestial realms, divine emanations, the creation of the material world by a lesser deity. The Gnostic demiurge who creates the flawed material world echoes Marduk creating from Tiamat's corpse. Though with inverted value, Gnostics saw material creation as evil, not as establishing good order from chaos. Folk traditions preserved fragments longest. Demon names, protective incantations, magical practices persisted in garbled form for centuries after the mythology itself died. Jewish magic texts from late antiquity include Mesopotamian demon names. Arabic folk magic preserves traces of Mesopotamian practices. These weren't understood as Mesopotamian by the people using them, just as effective traditional practices. Architectural influence survived too. The Ziggurat's stepped pyramid structure influenced later monumental architecture across the Near East. The hanging gardens concept, terrace gardens on monumental structures, appeared in later Persian and Hellenistic building. The processional way as urban design element reappeared in various forms. The calendar system influenced later traditions. The 7-day week, the 12-month year, various festival cycles, these had Mesopotamian origins even when later traditions attributed them to other sources. The Jewish calendar preserves Babylonian month names. Nisanu became Nisan, Tashritu became Tishrei. Legal concepts survived through biblical law. The lex talionis, eye for an eye, principle, the distinction between intentional and accidental harm. Various specific laws in the Torah show Mesopotamian legal influence. The very concept of written law codes descended from Mesopotamian innovation. But what was lost? Probably most of it. We have fragments of Mesopotamian literature, but those fragments reference other works, as it is said in the series title, that we've never found. We have temple hymns mentioning festivals and rituals we know nothing about. We have god names appearing once or twice with no explanation of their attributes or myths. The oral tradition, how stories were told, how they sounded, how audiences responded, what gestures or intonation shaped meaning, completely vanished. We have written texts, but they're like reading play scripts without ever seeing performances. The living context is gone. The music is lost. We know instruments' names, sometimes have remains of the instruments themselves, occasionally have notation marks on texts. But we can't reconstruct the actual melodies, the modes, the performance practice, the hymns that filled temples, the lamentations that moved audiences. Silent forever. Most devastating, the personal religious experience. We can read about rituals, but we can't know what it felt like to perform them as a believer. We can read prayers, but we can't experience the comfort or terror they brought to people who genuinely believed gods were listening. We can read myths, but we can't recover the worldview they shaped, what it meant to see every river and storm as divine action, every disaster as divine message. The gap between having the texts and understanding the lived reality is unbridgeable. We're eavesdropping on conversations whose context we can only partly reconstruct, reading letters addressed to people we'll never meet about situations we can't fully grasp. What remained was enough to tantalize, to suggest the grandeur of what was lost, but not enough to fully recover it. The Mesopotamian mythology that shaped 3 millennia of human thought, that created templates still influencing us today, mostly vanished. We caught fragments as they fell into the abyss. The rest is silence. The strange irony is that Mesopotamian mythology exerted more influence on later cultures as echo and fragment than it ever did through direct transmission. The ideas that spread most effectively were those absorbed, transformed, and claimed by successor traditions. Start with the Bible. Genesis opens with creation from water, tohu vabohu, formless and void, echoing the watery chaos of Apsu and Tiamat. God divides the waters, creates dry land, establishes cosmic order from primordial disorder. The structure directly parallels Enuma Elish, even though the theology transforms completely from polytheistic cosmic battle to monotheistic divine speech act. The 7-day creation framework may connect to Mesopotamian sacred significance of the number 7, though the parallel isn't perfect. The Garden of Eden with its tree of knowledge and tree of life echoes the Mesopotamian tradition of divine gardens with plants granting immortality or wisdom, elements appearing in Gilgamesh and other texts. The flood narrative is the most obvious borrowing. Genesis preserves details too specific to be coincidental. The boat's construction with pitch, the sending of birds in sequence, raven, then dove, the landing on a mountain, the sacrifice afterward, the divine promise never to flood the world again. These appear in the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh flood story, written 1,000 years before Genesis. But the meaning inverts. In Mesopotamian versions, the gods send the flood because humans are too noisy, disturbing divine rest. They're capricious, contradictory. Some gods regret the decision even as others enforce it. In Genesis, the flood comes as moral judgment against human wickedness, and God's promise afterward reflects covenant relationship, not divine regret at poor planning. The Tower of Babel story preserves memory of ziggurats, particularly Edom and Enki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth. The name Babel derives from Babylon, but again, the meaning transforms. What Mesopotamians saw as sacred architecture connecting heaven and earth becomes, in biblical narrative, an example of human hubris requiring divine punishment. Job, that troubling biblical book about undeserved suffering, parallels Mesopotamian wisdom literature addressing the same questions. The Babylonian Theodicy and Ludlul Bel Nemechi, often called the Babylonian Job, struggle with why the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper, why the gods seem indifferent to human justice. The literary strategies are similar: dialogue, complaint, attempted theological explanation, even as the ultimate answers differ. The Psalms include what are clearly adapted Mesopotamian hymns. Some scholars identify specific Mesopotamian originals behind biblical psalms, noting parallel structures, repeated phrases, similar imagery. The divine council imagery in Psalms, God surrounded by lesser divine beings, echoes Mesopotamian Council of Gods motifs, though monotheism has transformed the lesser gods into angels. Moving to Greek tradition, Hesiod's Theogony, 8th century BCE, shows possible Mesopotamian influence in its succession myth, younger gods overthrowing elder cosmic deities, particularly the castration of Uranus by Cronus paralleling the defeat of Apsu. Whether this represents direct influence or independent development of similar mythological patterns is debated. Greek philosophy absorbed Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge extensively. Thales, Pythagoras, and later Greek astronomers used Babylonian mathematical methods and observational data. Babylonian records spanning centuries gave Greek astronomers unprecedented precision in tracking planetary movements and predicting eclipses. But the Greeks transformed the interpretation. Where Babylonians read divine intention in celestial movements, Greeks increasingly saw natural law. The shift from theology to natural philosophy, the foundation of Western science, built on Mesopotamian empirical observation while rejecting its theological framework. Hellenistic astrology synthesized Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Greek elements into something new. The zodiac was Mesopotamian, the planetary associations with gods were Mesopotamian, the mathematical prediction methods were Babylonian. But the interpretation framework, linking celestial configurations to individual human destinies, the idea of natal horoscopes, was Greek innovation using Mesopotamian tools. Roman literature occasionally referenced Mesopotamian learning. Chaldean became synonymous with astrologer in Roman sources, the Chaldeans being Babylonians, but the term came to mean practitioners of celestial divination generally. Romans associated Babylon with ancient wisdom, magical knowledge, and exotic mystery cults. The Sibylline oracles, Jewish and Christian texts written in Greek but claiming to be ancient prophecies, included Babylon as symbol of imperial power and eventual divine judgment. Revelation's Whore of Babylon draws on this tradition, using Babylon as coded reference to Rome, but building on centuries of literary association between Babylon and idolatrous empire. Islamic tradition knew Babylon primarily through biblical and Quranic references. The Quran mentions Babylon specifically in connection with the angels Harut and Marut, who taught magic there as a test for humanity. Medieval Islamic scholars knew of ancient Mesopotamian astronomical achievements and incorporated Babylonian mathematical methods into Islamic astronomy. Arabic alchemical tradition claimed Mesopotamian origins, though the historical connection is unclear. Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary founder of alchemy in Greek and Arabic traditions, was sometimes associated with antediluvian wisdom from Mesopotamian or Egyptian sages. Whether genuine continuity or invented lineage is difficult to determine. Persian tradition, having actually ruled Mesopotamia under the Achaemenids, preserved some historical memory. Cyrus's conquest of Babylon remained significant in Persian historical consciousness. But the religious traditions, Zoroastrianism in Persia versus Mesopotamian polytheism, were distinct enough that little direct mythological transmission occurred. The legacy was often ironic. Babylon became symbolic of everything the biblical tradition opposed: idolatry, tyranny, sexual immorality, corruption. The civilization that actually created sophisticated law codes, advanced astronomy, great literature got reduced to a negative symbol. Early Christians saw Rome as Babylon, using Mesopotamia's greatest city as shorthand for imperial evil. Yet the positive legacy is undeniable. Every alphabet descends from systems first developed in or influenced by Mesopotamian writing. Mathematics still uses base 60 for time and angles because Mesopotamians found it convenient. Astronomy still uses observational techniques and constellation divisions with Mesopotamian origins. Law codes worldwide descend from principles first articulated in Hammurabi's code. The very concept of civilization, urban life, written law, specialized labor, monumental architecture, organized religion, professional priesthood, bureaucratic administration, was Mesopotamian invention. Every civilization since has been, in some sense, variation on templates Mesopotamia established. Perhaps most fundamentally, the idea that the universe has order, that human intelligence can comprehend that order, that knowledge can be systematically accumulated and transmitted across generations, these epistemological foundations were Mesopotamian contributions. They created the basic framework for how literate civilizations think about knowledge itself. The mythology's afterlife, then, was paradoxical. The specific gods were forgotten, their stories lost or corrupted. But the world they created, the conceptual universe of written law, astronomical observation, epic literature, urban civilization, became the foundation of everything that followed. They died, but their children thrived, often without knowing who their ancestors were. Picture a spring day in 1840. Austin Henry Layard, a young Englishman who should have been in Ceylon working for his uncle, instead stood before a mysterious mound near Mosul in what's now Iraq. Local Arabs called it Nimrud, vaguely associating it with the biblical Nimrod. Layard suspected it was ancient Nineveh. He started digging and found something extraordinary. A buried palace with walls covered in carved reliefs showing hunts, battles, divine figures. Stone bulls with human heads, Lamassu, protective deities, stood guard at gates. And everywhere, inscriptions in wedge-shaped characters no one could read. This was the beginning of Assyriology, the recovery of a lost civilization. Within a few years, similar excavations occurred across Mesopotamia. Hormizd Rassam uncovered Ashurbanipal's palace and library at Kuyunjik, the actual site of Nineveh, in 1853. Paul Emil Botta excavated Sargon-Tus palace at Khorsabad. Henry Rawlinson worked to decipher cuneiform inscriptions. The decipherment of cuneiform is its own fascinating story. Scholars had trilingual inscriptions from Persia, the same text in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Old Persian, because it was alphabetic and linguistically related to known Indo-European languages, yielded first. Using the Persian as a key, scholars gradually unlocked the more complex Babylonian and Assyrian cuneiform. When George Smith, working in the British Museum, first deciphered the flood tablet from Ashurbanipal's library in 1872, he reportedly became so excited he started undressing in the museum. Here was proof that the biblical flood narrative had Mesopotamian antecedents. The discovery caused sensation. Newspapers covered it. Religious controversy erupted. The line between biblical history and Mesopotamian mythology suddenly blurred. The tablets kept revealing wonders. The Enuma Elish creation epic. The Epic of Gilgamesh, including the flood story and the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Ishtar's descent to the underworld. The Atrahasis epic explaining humanity's creation. Hymns, lamentations, wisdom literature, astronomical texts, mathematical problems, medical diagnoses, legal codes, personal letters. Each discovery reshaped understanding. Hammurabi's law code, discovered in 1901 at Susa, where Elamites had taken it as war spoil, predated biblical law by centuries and showed clear parallels to Mosaic legislation. The sophistication of Mesopotamian mathematics, astronomy, medicine shocked scholars who'd assumed ancient peoples were primitive. But the discoveries were haphazard. Early excavations were more like treasure hunting than systematic archaeology. Tablets were removed from context, making interpretation difficult. Some were damaged by rough handling. Others were illegally sold to private collectors. The archaeological context that would have helped interpret finds was often destroyed in the rush to ship impressive artifacts to European museums. The politics of rediscovery were complicated. European imperial powers, Britain, France, later Germany, and America, competed to excavate major sites and fill their museums with Mesopotamian antiquities. This wasn't disinterested scholarship but colonial appropriation. The artifacts belonged to the land and people of Iraq, but they ended up in London, Paris, Berlin. Yet the irony is this: if the artifacts had remained in Iraq, many might have been lost. Looters would have sold them piecemeal. Wars, including recent ones, would have destroyed them. The centralized museum collections, however problematically acquired, preserved what local circumstances might not have. Modern interpretation faced challenges beyond decipherment. Cuneiform texts were often fragmentary. Multiple versions of the same story existed with variations. Cultural context was initially unknown. What rituals accompanied these texts? What beliefs did ancient readers bring to them? How did oral performance shape written versions? Slowly, painstakingly, scholars reconstructed context. Archaeological excavations of temples showed where rituals occurred. Economic texts revealed temple administration. Personal letters showed religious attitudes of ordinary people. Gradually, Mesopotamian civilization came back into focus, though always partially, incompletely. Interpretation evolved through phases. Initial Victorian readings emphasized biblical parallels and saw Mesopotamian myths as crude precursors to superior biblical revelation. Early 20th century scholarship read myths as nature allegories, flood stories about actual floods, fertility gods about agricultural cycles. Mid-20th century structuralism analyzed mythological patterns, seeing universal human concerns expressed through culturally specific symbols. Feminist scholarship from the 1970s onward recovered goddess traditions and examined gender dynamics in mythology. Post-colonial approaches questioned the power dynamics of who interprets whom and whose interpretations become authoritative. Recent scholarship emphasizes context and avoiding false universalization. Mesopotamian mythology wasn't the same thing across 3,000 years and multiple cultures. Sumerian theology differed from Babylonian. Early Bronze Age concerns weren't identical to Neo-Assyrian ones. The myths evolved, and we need to track those evolutions rather than treating Mesopotamian mythology as monolithic. Digital technologies are revolutionizing the field. High-resolution imaging reveals eroded text on damaged tablets. Databases compile tens of thousands of texts, making pattern recognition possible. Computer-assisted translation helps with fragmentary texts. 3D modeling reconstructs destroyed sites. Still, frustrations remain. Perhaps 90% of cuneiform tablets ever written are lost, eroded, destroyed, or still underground. Of surviving tablets, many are fragmentary. Some crucial texts are represented by a single copy. We have references to works we've never found. We know some gods only by name with no surviving myths about them. The interpretation will never be complete or final. We're recovering a civilization from fragments, attempting to understand a worldview radically different from our own. Reading texts designed for audiences whose basic assumptions we can only partly reconstruct. Yet what's been recovered is remarkable. We can read Mesopotamian voices directly now, hear them speak across 4 millennia. We know their stories, their concerns, their questions. We can appreciate their intellectual achievements, their artistic sophistication, their genuine wrestling with perennial human problems. The rediscovery proved that civilizations don't truly die if they leave written records. They can sleep for millennia and be awakened by patient scholars with linguistic keys and archaeological shovels. The voices can speak again if someone learns to listen. Let's step back from the chronology and the details, from the specific names and places, and ask, what does this mythology mean? What patterns emerge across 3,000 years of stories? What were Mesopotamians really trying to understand and express? At the deepest level, Mesopotamian mythology grappled with order versus chaos. This isn't unique to Mesopotamia, but their particular expression is revealing. Creation wasn't peaceful but violent. Marduk had to kill Tiamat to create the universe. Order had to defeat chaos in cosmic battle. And crucially, chaos wasn't annihilated but transformed into the building blocks of reality. This reflects lived experience. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't gentle, predictable rivers. They flooded catastrophically or failed to rise enough, bringing different disasters. The environment was harsh, unpredictable, requiring constant human effort to impose agricultural order on wild land. Chaos wasn't theoretical but immediate, recurring, requiring perpetual vigilance. The mythology said, order is real but fragile. It was won through struggle and must be maintained through continued effort. This wasn't pessimism so much as realism. The rituals weren't superstition but enacted commitment to maintaining cosmic order through human participation. Think about what this means psychologically. You're not passive in the universe's operation. Your rituals, your offerings, your proper behavior actually matter cosmically. The temple service you perform, the festivals you participate in, these aren't empty gestures but essential maintenance of reality itself. This gave ordinary life profound significance. The relationship between gods and humans reveals another deep pattern: mutual dependence without equality. The gods created humans to serve them, yes, but this created reciprocal obligation. Gods protected cities that honored them properly. Kings who maintained temples received divine support. The contract ran both ways, even if the terms weren't balanced. This reflects social structures, relationships between rulers and subjects, landowners and workers, patrons and clients. Everyone had a place in hierarchical order, but hierarchy implied mutual obligation, not just one-way domination. The powerful had responsibilities to the powerless, or cosmic order was violated. The mythology's treatment of death is particularly revealing. The underworld Irkalla was democratically grim. Rich and poor, virtuous and wicked, all went to the same dusty realm to eat clay and wear feathers. There was no reward for virtue, no punishment for vice in the afterlife. This forced ethical reasoning into a different framework. You didn't behave well to earn heavenly reward. You did it to maintain cosmic order, to fulfill contractual obligations, to avoid immediate divine punishment. Ethics became about this life, about functioning properly within established order, not about securing better afterlife circumstances. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality captures this beautifully. He's the mightiest king, two-thirds divine, yet he can't escape death. The gods decided at humanity's creation that death would be our portion. Even semi-divine heroes must accept mortality. The wisdom literature says, accept your limits, find meaning within bounds, don't reach for what the gods have forbidden. This is profoundly conservative theology in some ways. It justifies existing hierarchies as cosmic necessity. It discourages challenging established order. Yet it also creates ethical demands on the powerful. They must fulfill their roles properly or face divine punishment. Power isn't just privilege but sacred responsibility. The goddess traditions reveal complexity around gender and power. Ishtar/Inanna was sexually autonomous, militarily powerful, capable of descent to death and resurrection. She wasn't defined by relationship to male deities but had independent agency, desires, domains of authority. Other goddesses, Ereshkigal, Ninhursag, Tiamat, wielded real power in the mythology. Yet actual women's status didn't match divine female power. The mythology acknowledged female authority theologically while human society constrained it practically. This gap between theological possibility and social reality created tension that different periods resolved differently. The flood narratives operate on multiple levels simultaneously. Literally, they may preserve memory of catastrophic flooding. The Persian Gulf region experienced massive inundation as sea levels rose after the last ice age. Theologically, they explore divine power and limitation. The gods who send the flood regret it, recognizing they nearly destroyed the workers they depend on. Ethically, the stories grapple with innocent suffering. Why do disasters kill indiscriminately? The Mesopotamian answer isn't satisfying by modern standards. The gods are capricious or humans collectively offended them, but it's honest about the randomness of catastrophe. Virtue doesn't protect you from floods. The creation from corpse motif, universe made from Tiamat's body, suggests several ideas at once. First, the old must die for the new to emerge. Second, what appears defeated isn't destroyed but transformed into something useful. Third, the universe itself contains violence and death in its foundation. Creation isn't separate from destruction but built from it. Compare this to creation by speech in Genesis, where God speaks and reality obeys. Mesopotamian creation requires physical struggle, divine sweat, violent conquest. This isn't inferior theology but different, more visceral, more acknowledging of how actual change happens through conflict and transformation. The astronomical emphasis throughout Mesopotamian religion points to a sophisticated understanding. Celestial movements are orderly, predictable, mathematical. If gods move in sky according to discernible patterns, then cosmic order exists, reality isn't random chaos. The detailed observation of planets and stars was theological investigation, learning how gods behave by watching their movements. Yet this created tension. The more predictable celestial mechanics became, the less they seemed like willful divine action. The seeds of natural philosophy, explaining phenomena through laws rather than divine whim, were planted by astronomical precision. Mesopotamian priest astronomers created tools that would eventually challenge mythological worldviews. The pattern of cities rising and falling, empires succeeding one another, appears in the mythology itself. King lists tracing dynasties before the flood, and after the succession of cosmic rulers from Anu to Enlil to Marduk, these mirror political reality. Power shifts, new centers emerge, but fundamental cosmic order persists beneath surface changes. This created remarkable cultural continuity. Conquerors didn't destroy predecessor gods but absorbed them, reinterpreted them, claimed continuity with them. The Akkadians didn't replace Sumerian gods but synchronized them. The Babylonians elevated Marduk but maintained earlier deities. This theological flexibility enabled cultural survival through political disruption. The hero myths Gilgamesh, Etna, Adapa explore the boundaries of human possibility. What can extraordinary humans achieve? Where are the limits set by divine decree? These stories test boundaries while ultimately affirming them. Heroes can be mighty, wise, achieve great things, but not immortality, not equality with gods, not escape from fundamental human condition. This creates a mythology of acceptance rather than transcendence. You work within your nature, your station, your limits. You can excel within boundaries but shouldn't try to breach them. This conservatism has costs. It can justify oppression, discourage innovation, but also benefits. It prevents overreach, acknowledges reality, counsels wisdom over hubris. The magical and ritual texts reveal practical concerns beneath theological abstraction. People wanted protection from demons, cure for diseases, success in love, victory in battle, prosperity in business. The gods weren't just cosmic principles but powers you could petition, bargain with, influence through proper ritual. This creates what we might call pragmatic theology. You perform rituals not just from faith but because they work or seem to, often enough, given confirmation bias and selective memory. When they don't work, you adjust technique, add prayers, try different gods. Religion becomes experimental, testable, pragmatic alongside its cosmic order dimensions. The lament literature. Cities personified as women mourning their destruction, goddesses weeping for fallen temples, processes collective trauma. Disasters happened. Cities fell. People needed ways to express grief, to understand catastrophe, to find meaning in loss. The laments provided structured mourning, theological explanation, divine anger, and hope, possibility of restoration if the gods relent. Running through everything is this fundamental pattern. The universe requires active maintenance. Nothing persists automatically. Order must be constantly renewed through ritual, proper behavior, sacrifices, temple service. Neglect brings chaos back. This makes human action cosmically significant while creating perpetual anxiety about getting it right. Compare this to religions that promise final victory of good over evil, permanent heavenly rest, escape from cosmic struggle. Mesopotamian mythology offers no such consolation. The struggle is permanent. Order versus chaos is eternal tension requiring eternal vigilance. This is exhausting but also empowering. You matter, your efforts matter, always. Perhaps the deepest pattern is this: Mesopotamian mythology insists on facing reality without comforting illusions. Death is real and final for humans. Disasters happen indiscriminately. The gods are powerful but not perfectly just or loving. Suffering often has no satisfying explanation. The universe isn't designed for human happiness. Yet within this unflinching realism, they found meaning. Through proper service, through maintaining order, through fulfilling your role in cosmic hierarchy, through accepting limits while excelling within them, life gained purpose. Not transcendent purpose, not escape to better existence, but meaningful participation in ongoing cosmic maintenance. This is harder, in some ways, than religion's promising ultimate redemption. It offers less comfort, but it's honest about the human condition in ways that remain challenging and relevant 4,000 years later. The stars are still visible above Mesopotamia, the same stars ancient astronomers observed and catalogued millennia ago. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow, though their courses have shifted. The sun still rises over the desert where ziggurats once stood, where Babylon once shone with glazed bricks and impossible grandeur. But the gods are silent. The temples are rubble. The voices that once sang hymns at dawn, that recited Enuma Elish at New Year festivals, that prayed for protection and prosperity, those voices fell silent 2,000 years ago. the last person who genuinely believed Marduk controlled creation, who felt Ishtar's presence as immediate and real, who understood the cosmic significance of temple ritual. That person died centuries before Islam, before Christianity even fully formed. Yet here we are talking about them. The strange afterlife of dead religions. They become stories we tell, patterns we trace, puzzles we solve. The mythology that shaped 3,000 years of human thought, that created templates we still unconsciously follow, exists now primarily as object of study rather than lived faith. What do we lose when a mythology dies? We lose a complete worldview, an entire way of understanding reality. We lose the comfort and terror of divine presence in daily life. We lose the cosmic significance of ordinary actions. Your plowing, your brewing, your lovemaking don't maintain universal order anymore. They're just what you do. But we also lose the burden. You don't have to worry that missed rituals will bring disaster. You don't have to live in fear of capricious divine anger. You don't have to accept your station as cosmically ordained. The death of this mythology created space for different, perhaps more humane ways of thinking. The gifts they gave us persist unconsciously. When you divide a circle into 360 degrees, when you measure time in hours of 60 minutes, when you expect laws to be written and public rather than arbitrary and hidden, when you read epic poetry or astronomical tables or medical diagnoses, you're using innovations that began in Mesopotamia. When you think about the universe as ordered rather than chaotic, as potentially comprehensible through observation and reason, as operating according to patterns that intelligence can grasp, you're thinking thoughts first articulated systematically by Mesopotamian priest scholars who saw divine order in celestial movements. The mythology itself, the specific stories, influenced you even if you've never heard them directly. The biblical narratives, even if only culturally, echo Mesopotamian originals. The flood story, the garden of immortality, the cosmic battle against chaos, the descent to underworld and resurrection. These patterns entered Western imagination through biblical adaptation of Mesopotamian themes. Even our anxieties are Mesopotamian in flavor. The fear that order is fragile, that civilization could collapse, that barbarity lurks beneath thin veneer of culture, that catastrophe could strike indiscriminately. These worried Mesopotamians watching their cities rise and fall, their empires flourish and crumble. We've inherited their concerns along with their innovations. Sitting with this mythology, really sitting with it, means confronting uncomfortable ideas. The universe might not care about human justice. Virtue might not be rewarded. Death might be the end, dusty and democratic. Your significance might be local and temporary rather than cosmic and eternal. The gods, if they exist, might not be primarily concerned with your happiness. Mesopotamian mythology offers no easy comfort. It doesn't promise that everything happens for a reason, that the arc of universe bends toward justice, that suffering will be redeemed in heaven. It says, this is reality, harsh and beautiful, and your job is to maintain what order you can, fulfill your obligations, find meaning in service and proper action, accept what cannot be changed. There's a stoic wisdom in this, a clear-eyed acceptance of limits combined with insistence on human responsibility within those limits. You can't escape death, but you can live well. You can't control the gods, but you can serve them properly. You can't prevent all disasters, but you can maintain the rituals that assert order against chaos. The tragedy is that this entire worldview, sophisticated, profound, grappling honestly with human existence, nearly vanished completely. For 2,000 years it was simply gone, its texts unreadable, its monuments mysterious, its gods unremembered. If archaeologists hadn't excavated Mesopotamian sites, if scholars hadn't deciphered cuneiform, this would have remained lost. How many other mythologies, other complete worldviews, did vanish irretrievably? How many ways of understanding existence were lost without trace? Their peoples conquered or assimilated, their languages forgotten, their stories untold. Mesopotamian mythology survived by accident. Clay tablets baked by conquering fires, buried in collapsed libraries, waiting underground for millennia. The recovery is ongoing. New tablets are still being translated, new interpretations proposed, new contexts discovered. Each generation of scholars brings different questions, different concerns, different insights to these ancient texts. The mythology doesn't speak with one voice because we don't listen with one ear. Perhaps that's appropriate. Mesopotamian mythology itself was never monolithic or static. It evolved across 3,000 years, adapted to new circumstances, absorbed foreign influences, changed as society changed. Marduk wasn't always supreme. Ishtar accumulated attributes and absorbed other goddesses. The flood story existed in multiple versions with varying details. So when we interpret it now, we're participating in the same process. Adaptation, reinterpretation, finding new meanings in old stories. We ask questions Mesopotamians didn't ask about gender and power, about psychological symbolism, about cultural contact and influence. They asked questions we might not prioritize, about ritual precision, about proper divine service, about reading omens correctly. Both approaches are valid. Neither recovers what it actually meant to live within this mythology as unquestioned reality. That's gone, irrecoverable, knowable only through imagination and careful inference from fragmentary evidence. What I hope you take from this journey through Mesopotamian mythology isn't just information, names, dates, stories, but something deeper. An appreciation for how completely different, intelligent, sophisticated people can understand reality. A recognition that our own worldview isn't inevitable or universal but culturally specific, historically contingent, subject to change. An awareness that civilizations rise and fall, that what seems permanent can vanish, that 3,000 years of accumulated wisdom can be lost in a few generations of neglect. A humility about our own certainties, our own mythologies, whether we call them religious or scientific or simply how things are. And maybe a kind of wonder at the human capacity to create meaning, to impose order on chaos, to build magnificent structures, physical and intellectual, even knowing they won't last forever. The Mesopotamians knew empires fell. They'd seen it happen repeatedly. They built anyway. They wrote anyway. They created beauty and wisdom anyway. Those clay tablets with their tiny wedge-shaped marks. Someone pressed those marks with care, preserving stories they thought important, knowledge they believed worth transmitting. They wrote for the future, never imagining how distant that future would be, how alien their world would become, how hard later generations would have to work just to read their words. But here we are, reading them, listening to voices from 4,000 years ago, hearing their concerns, their wisdom, their questions. The gods they served are dead, but the humans who served them speak still, if we listen carefully. The night is deep now wherever you are. The same night that covered Mesopotamia, though the stars have shifted slightly in their patterns, though the constellations they named we name differently, though the planets they saw as gods we see as worlds. Somewhere in Iraq, the mounds that were Babylon and Ur and Uruk sit silent under stars. The winds that sculpt them now carved them millennia ago. The rivers that gave life to civilization flow on, indifferent to the cities that rose beside them and fell. And we, inheritors of traditions we barely recognize as inheritance, sit in the darkness they first mapped and measured, asking questions they first articulated, using tools they first invented, thinking thoughts shaped by patterns they established. The mythology is dead. Long live the mythology. Sleep well, friend. And if you dream tonight of dragons made from chaos, of gods building universes from corpses, of heroes seeking immortality they cannot find, of ancient cities gleaming in vanished glory, well, the Mesopotamians believed dreams were messages from the divine. Perhaps they still are. Perhaps the dead gods have one more message to send. Where in the world are you listening from? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know whose night I've shared tonight, whose darkness has held these ancient lights alongside mine. Until next time.